Hey there, welcome to Quiet History. Tonight, you're not a king, you're not a noble, you're a medieval knight. Exhausted, underpaid, constantly injured, and sleeping in damp stone rooms. Let's slowly walk through why this honorable life was far worse than most people imagine.
The cold woke him, as it did every morning. It was not a simple chill, but a deep, marrow-seeking presence that had seeped through the stone walls of the manor overnight, settling into the very air. Sir Thomas lay still for a moment, eyes closed against the absolute dark, feeling the familiar ache bloom in his joints. His left shoulder, where a lance had once found a gap in his youth, throbbed with a dull, rhythmic insistence. His right knee, twisted in a fall from a horse years past, was a knot of stiff protest. He pushed back the thin wool blanket, the movement sending a fresh wave of cold across his skin. The rushes beneath the bed, changed too infrequently, released a sigh of damp earth and old trodden herbs. The smell of stale wool from his nightshirt mingled with it, a scent as much a part of him as his own breath. His feet found the floor, and the shock of the icy stone was a complete and instantaneous baptism. He stood, a tall shadow in the blackness, every year of his life a weight upon his spine. He knew the room by heart, this chamber that was his by right and by poverty. His hand found the small iron candle holder on the chest near his bed, his fingers tracing the familiar dents and cold metal. The flint and steel were beside it. The first strike sparked, a tiny, furious star in the void. The second caught the charred linen wick. A flame, small and tremulous, fought into being. In its hesitant glow, the room conceded its shapes. The rough-hewn beams of the ceiling, stained dark with decades of smoke. The tapestry on the far wall, its colours long faded to vague ghosts of blue and red, depicting a hunt he could no longer make out clearly. The light found his face in the polished surface of a bronze wash basin. The reflection showed a man worn smooth by use, deep lines carved from nose to mouth, trenches dug by weather and worry, eyes that were once a brighter blue, now looked out from nests of wrinkles, the skin beneath them bruised with permanent fatigue. His beard, more grey than brown, was untrimmed. The candlelight caught the threads of his nightshirt, illuminating not fine linen, but a coarse, patched garment. The cuffs frayed, a clumsy mend visible over his heart. He lifted the candle, and the pool of light travelled with him, pushing the shadows back to the corners, where they pooled like cold water. He moved to the narrow window, unshattered. Beyond the thick, greenish glass, the world was a study in monochrome. The sky was the colour of a fresh bruise, a deep purple bleeding into charcoal at the horizon. Not a star remained. The fields lay under a shroud of mist, the skeletal outlines of bare trees rising from it like the ribs of some buried leviathan. Dawn was a promise, not a gift. It meant the cessation of darkness, but not the arrival of warmth or ease. It meant the beginning of the day's demands. A draught, sharp as a blade, sliced through a gap in the window frame and made the candle flame gutter and dance. He cupped a hand around it, feeling the fragile heat against his palm. This small, defiant warmth was the only comfort he could claim. The silence of the manor was profound, broken only by the distant, rhythmic creak of a shutter and the sigh of the wind in the chimney. No servants stirred yet, no hounds barked in the yard. For these few stolen moments, he existed in a suspended state, between the oblivion of sleep and the relentless press of consciousness. He thought of nothing grand, no memories of glory, no plans for legacy, His mind was occupied by the mundane inventory of the coming hours, the audit of the granary stores overdue, the conversation needed with the miller about disputed tolls, the letter to his liege lord requesting, again, an extension on the payment for his marriage license, the words of supplication already sour in his mouth, the inspection of the boundary wall where the tenants reported stones had been pulled away. Each task was a pebble, but together they formed the cairn beneath which he laboured. The candle wax dripped, a slow tear, hardening on the iron holder. The light in the east was strengthening, leaching the purple from the sky and replacing it with a thin, watery grey. The mist began to blow from within. The world was waking, and with it the weight settled more firmly upon his shoulders. It was the weight of title without wealth, of duty without respite, of a life lived in the long, cold shadow of expectation. He took a final breath of the still, private air, then turned from the window. The day awaited, and Sir Thomas, with a quiet sigh that misted in the frigid room, began to shoulder its familiar, melancholy burden. Etienne's hands were cold, and they fumbled with the laces. Sir Thomas stood on the worn rush mat in the centre of his chamber, arms slightly raised, enduring the ritual. The first layer was the gambeson, a quilted jacket of coarse linen stuffed with raw wool. It smelled faintly of old sweat and the lavender his wife had tucked into the chest months before, a ghost of fragrance lost beneath the musk of use. As Etienne pulled it over his head and began tightening the side laces, Sir Thomas felt the familiar, smothering embrace. The padding was thick across his chest and shoulders, designed to absorb blows and cushion the metal to come, but it immediately trapped his body's heat and restricted the expansion of his ribs. Each breath required a conscious effort. Next came the male, hauberk. Etienne hefted the heavy, knee-length shirt of interlocked iron rings, its weight making the young man stagger a step. The metal was cold, even through the gambeson, and it settled over Sir Thomas with a sound like a sack of coins being emptied. The squire lifted the link sleeves, and Sir Thomas pushed his arms through. The weight was immense, and distributed pressure that pulled at his shoulders and compressed his spine. The hauberk had been his father's. Thousands of rings, each hand-forged and riveted, now dull with a patina of old oil and minuscule rust. It smelled of iron and rancid tallow. As Etienne laced the leather cord at the throat, the male pressed against the gambeson, and a specific pinch began just below Sir Thomas's left shoulder blade, a known, nagging point of conflict between body and shell. Then, the plate. Etienne brought the cuisses, the thigh guards, first. They were fashioned from hammered steel, strapped over mail-clad legs with leather belts. The metal was cold against his thighs, the edges not quite rolled enough, promising chafing with every stride. The polanes followed, encasing his knees, their articulated joints stiff from disuse. Each piece was secured with trembling fingers, the buckles and points requiring a frustrating precision. The greaves for his shins, the vambraces for his forearms, the pauldrons for his shoulders. Each addition was a new constraint. The pauldrons, in particular, bit into the male at his neck, limiting the turn of his head to a stiff, creaking swivel. The cuirass was the centerpiece. Etienne lifted the front and back plates of the breastplate, their surfaces scratched and dented from long service. They closed around Sir Thomas's torso, like the jaws of a metal beast. The squire fastened the leather straps at the sides and over the shoulders, pulling them tight. Sir Thomas exhaled, forcing the air out to make room, and held the breath as the final buckle was secured. The fit was close, too close. He did not sit on his body so much as imprison it. The curved steel compressed his chest, making deep breaths impossible. A ridge along the bottom edge dug into his hips. The weight, now distributed, but cumulative, was a constant, downward pull, a reminder of gravity's amplified claim. As Etienne knelt to attach the sabatons, the articulated steel shoes, to his mail-clad feet, the door opened. Hugh the armourer entered without ceremony, a squat, broad man with a permanent squint and forearms like knotted oak. He carried the smell of the forge with him, coal smoke and hot metal. He watched the final stages of the process with a critical, proprietorial eye. "Left strap is fraying," Hugh said, his voice a gravelly rumble. He pointed a thick, soot-stained finger at the shoulder buckle. "See? 2 more pulls and it parts. Then your arm hangs loose, and the clever lad puts a dagger in the gap." He moved closer, his gaze scanning the harness. He rapped a knuckle against the breastplate, a dull talk echoing in the quiet room. "Needs oiling, not polish for show. Oil in the joints. Metal grinds on metal, wears itself thin, then seizes up when you need to raise your arm to block. You'll be a statue for some archer to topple. For some archer to topple." Sir Thomas remained still, a man becoming a monument. Hugh walked a slow circle around him. "It never fit," he stated, not with sympathy but with the blunt certainty of a natural law. "You think it should. You pay enough. You stand for hours being measured. But the body is not still. It breathes. It swells with heat and shrinks with cold. It bends and twists. The armor is dead. It has one shape." He tapped the cuirass again, near the lower rib. "It sits here today. Tomorrow, after a hard ride, your body changes, and it pinches here instead. It is a cage, Sir Thomas. The best you can hope for is a cage that does not draw blood or break your bones when you fall." Etienne, looking anxious, presented the gauntlets. Sir Thomas slid his hands into the articulated steel gloves. The interior lined with worn sheepskin. His fingers found the leather grips within, but the fine control of his bare hands was gone, replaced by a clumsy mittened sensation. Finally, the arming cap of padded linen, and then the helm. It was a bassinet, with a hinged visor. Etienne lifted it, a steel skull weighing more than a cooking pot. The world disappeared in a moment of darkness and muffled sound as it settled over his head. The visor was lowered, its sightlines reducing his vision to a narrow, grid-crossed slit. His own breathing became loud in the enclosed space, hot and moist, fogging the inside of the metal near his mouth. The familiar, metallic taste of the air filled his lungs. He was complete, encased. The knight in his shell. He took a tentative step, and the entire assembly responded with a chorus of soft rings, creaks, and shifts. The pinch below his shoulder blade flared. The cuirass pressed on his hips. He felt not empowered, but burdened. A living core encased in a heavy, ill-fitting, and bitterly cold second skin. Hugh gave a final, approving nod at the integrity of the construction, yet his words hung in the air. A truth more solid than the steel itself. It was a miserable, constricting shell, and it would never, ever sit perfectly on the moving body within. The mist in the courtyard was a damp med grey shroud, moting the world to shades of slate and pearl. It clung to the cobblestones, beaded on the wooden shafts of the pals, and softened the harsh lines of the manor's walls. From within this haze came the rhythmic, jarring thwack of wood on wood, a sound as unromantic as the splitting of logs. Sir Thomas moved through the drills with a weary efficiency, his body a machine of long habit. Each swing of the practice sword, a heavy, blunt length of ash, transmitted a shock up his arms, vibrating through the vambraces and into the bones of his elbows. The weight of the armor transformed every motion. A simple overhead cut became a laborious hauling of mass against gravity, the muscles of his back and shoulders burning in protest beneath the mail and padding. To return to guard was not a swift rougher, but a controlled collapse, fighting the momentum of the steel he carried. Opposite him, Etienne mirrored the movements with earnest, anxious energy. The young man's breath plumed in the cold air, visible even through the open visor of his borrowed helm. His own strikes were too wide, his recoveries off balance, his feet slipping on the slick stones. Sir Thomas watched, his own breathing a loud, ragged concert inside his enclosed helmet. The air grew hot and stale, tasting of the oiled steel and the damp wool of his arming cap. A trickle of sweat traced a path from his temple down his neck, itching madly where he could not scratch. He called a halt with a raised hand. The cessation of movement made the aches more pronounced. A deep burn in his thighs from maintaining the stance, a sharp pinch in his side from the cuirass, a throbbing in his wrist from the last parry. He lifted his visor, the cold mist kissing his sweaty face like a relief and a punishment combined. His voice, when it came, was flat with fatigue. "You are leaning into the cut," he said to Etienne. "You seek power from the lunge. Power comes from the ground, through the legs, turned by the hips. The sword is the last link in the chain, not the first. You lean, you are off balance. A child could push you over." He demonstrated his own movement economical, almost grudging. He planted his feet, feeling the unyielding sabatons on the stone, rotated his hips beneath the constricting weight of the fold, and let the motion travel up his torso and out through his arms. The practice sword cut the mist with a solid whistling sound. It was not a heroic blow, but a functional one, devoid of flourish. The effort still made his heart hammer against his ribs, a frantic bird in a metal cage. "Again," he commanded, lowering his visor. The thwack resumed, a monotonous percussion against the morning's quiet. For Etienne, this was still a novelty edged with fear and aspiration. For Sir Thomas, it was a purgatorial repetition. This was the truth of knightly training, stripped of song and story. No inspiring speeches in sun-dappled glades, no wise old masters revealing secrets of ultimate technique. There was only the grind, the 10,000th repetition of a basic block, the muscle memory beaten into the body through sheer, dogged persistence, until it became a reflex faster than thought. It was the cultivation of endurance for pain, for exhaustion, for the mind-numbing boredom of the act itself. His own muscles, once resilient, now complained with a veteran's bitterness. Old tear in his shoulder, long healed, sang a dull aria with every raise of the sword. The weight of the hauberk felt heavier with each passing moment, its burden constant and inescapable. The helmet was a world of its own, hot, dim, echoing chamber, where his own breath was the loudest wind. The romantic ideal was the swift, gleaming knight on the charger. The reality was this: a middle-aged man, aching and short of breath, standing in the cold damp, performing the same dull motions he had performed for 30 years, so that he might, if God willed, survive performing them once more in earnest. He corrected Etienne's grip, the gauntleted hands clumsy as they adjusted the younger man's fingers on the leather-bound hilt. He nudged a foot into better placement with the toe of his sabaton. Each instruction was given in short, breathless phrases. Back, straight, eyes forward. Don't watch my sword, watch my shoulders. The lessons were not secrets, but simple, brutal physics. Leverage, balance, momentum, all made infinitely more difficult by the crushing weight of their shell. After what felt like an age, he called a final halt. The silence that followed the last impact was profound, filled only with the sound of their labored breathing. Etienne sank to one knee, visor thrown open, face flushed and dripping. Sir Thomas remained standing, though every joint pleaded otherwise. He felt the sweat cooling on his skin beneath the gambeson, a clammy layer that would soon grow cold and uncomfortable. The mist seemed thicker now, a cold sweat on the face of the world itself. He looked at the earnest, exhausted young man before him and saw the ghost of his own past enthusiasm, soon to be worn smooth by the endless, grinding toil. The courtyard, the pels, the practice swords. These were the true crucible of knighthood, not the battlefield. Here, the spirit was tempered, not in the fire of combat, but in the cold water of repetition, in the mundane, painful, and exhausting daily labor of preparing the body to bear the unbearable. It was a morning's toil, identical to 1,000 before it, and God willing, 1,000 yet to come. He sheathed the practice sword at his hip, the movement of familiar agony, and turned toward the hall, the weight of his armor feeling less like protection and more like a sentence. The forge was a pocket of hell on earth, a realm of elemental struggle. To step from the damp grey mist of the courtyard into Hugh's workshop was to be assaulted by a wall of dry, searing heat that stole the breath and prickled the skin. Sir Thomas and Etienne paused on the threshold, their eyes adjusting to the gloom, which was not true darkness but a deep smoky amber, pierced by the furious orange heart of the furnace. The air was thick with smells, layered and potent. The acrid bite of coal smoke was the foundation, a constant presence that coated the tongue. Beneath it lay the scent of hot metal, a sharp, ozone-like tang that spoke of transformation, and weaving through both was the sour, nose-pinching odor of acid and vinegar used for etching and cleaning. It was the smell of work, of creation, and relentless maintenance, with no room for perfume or pretense. Hugh stood at his anvil, a block of iron worn smooth and concave by countless blows. He was a figure carved from soot and muscle, his leather apron blackened and stiff, his arms gleaming with sweat in the firelight. He did not look up as they entered, his entire being focused on the piece of metal, glowing cherry red in his tongs. With a practiced motion he transferred it to the anvil and began to hammer. The sound was not a simple clang, but a ringing, rhythmic conversation between man and metal, each blow precise, shaping the glowing plate with a force that seemed to shake the very dust from the boss. Rafters. Only when the piece had cooled to a dull red did he quench it in a barrel of oil with a furious hiss and a billow of foul-smelling smoke. Then he turned, wiping his hands on his apron, leaving new streaks of grime. His face was smudged with soot, the lines around his eyes etched deep by years of squinting into the fire. His hands, when he gestured for them to approach, were a landscape of old burns, calluses, and blackened nails. "You see it?" he grunted, not as a greeting, but as the start of a lesson. He pointed to a breastplate resting on a wooden stand. It was a fine piece, once, with elegant fluting and a polished sheen. Now marred, Hugh ran a thick finger over its surface, and the sound was like sandpaper on stone. There and there, the enemy you never see. He lifted the breastplate, angling it to catch the dim light. Tiny freckled pits dotted the steel, especially near the edges and around the rivets. They were not battle scars, but the work of a slower, more insidious foe. Rust, Hugh said. The word a curse. It breathes in the damp. It drinks the sweat from your gambeson. A single night's neglect, a missed wiping, and it sinks its teeth in. He tapped a particularly deep pit. This weakens the metal. A solid blow here now, and instead of glancing off, it might buckle. Might drive a splinter of your own armor into your lung. He set the breastplate down with a heavy thud and moved to a cluttered bench, picking up a rag soaked in a murky liquid. The vinegar smell intensified. "This is the war," he said, scrubbing at a vambrace with a violent circular motion. Not the glorious charge, not the parry and thrust. This, the daily, losing battle against the air itself. The coal for the fire, the oil for the joints, the sand for polishing, the acid for cleaning. Each has a cost. Each is a leak in your purse. He turned his soot-stained gaze fully on Sir Thomas, his eyes sharp in the gloom. "You think the cost is in the making. You are wrong. The making is a mountain of silver. Yes, a single gauntlet." He gestured to a beautifully articulated steel glove on a shelf. "A year's income for a good farmer. A full harness, like yours." He nodded at Sir Thomas. "Years of saving, a lifetime of debt for a lesser man. But that is just the seed. The true cost is in the keeping. In the feeding of this hungry beast you strap to your body." Hugh picked up a hammer with a rounded head and moved to another piece, a pauldron with a fresh, gleaming dent near its apex. A fall from a horse, a practice yard mishap. He positioned the pauldron on a small, leather-covered anvil and began to tap, gently at first, then with more force, working the dent out with a meticulous, patient rhythm. The process was agonizingly slow. See? See, the metal is hardened. You cannot just beat it flat. You must coax it, heat it, work it, cool it, slowly. A day's work for a dent a child could make with a stone. A day I must charge for. A day you are without that piece, your shoulder vulnerable. He paused, letting the ringing fade. The workshop seemed to listen. "Every component," he continued, his voice lower now, a confidential rumble amidst the crackle of the fire. "The cuirass, the fold, the greaves, the sabatons, each is a kingdom with its own tax. A cracked buckle, a worn strap, a sprung rivet, none are free. A knight's wealth is not measured in land or gold, but in the integrity of his steel, and integrity is a fleeting thing, bought and rebought with every season, every campaign, every foolish stumble." Sir Thomas stood silently, the heat of the forge baking the damp from his cloak, but offering no warmth. He looked at the pitted breastplate, the slowly healing pauldron, the racks of tools, the barrels of precious oil and vinegar. He saw not a workshop, but an altar where his dwindling resources were sacrificed to the grim gods of necessity. Each hammer fall was the chime of a coin spent. Each wisp of acid smoke was the evaporation of profit. The armor was not just a shell. It was a living, hungry entity, and its sustenance was the slow, relentless consumption of his entire estate. Hugh's gaze remained fixed on Sir Thomas, the lesson pivoting from the armor's upkeep to the broader, more ruinous economy it anchored. "The horse," he stated, as if introducing a malevolent spirit, "that is where dreams of glory go to die in a ditch of debt." He wiped his hands on his apron, leaving new streaks. "A proper destrier, trained not to shy from flashing steel and trumpet blasts. Its price could buy this workshop, and the land it sits on. And it is a fragile investment, a stray arrow, a hidden rabbit hole, a twisted fatlock on wet ground. Poof, a lifetime of savings, a cornerstone of your battlefield worth. Gone in a moment. Then you are a knight on a palfrey, a laughingstock, or worse, a footman in a lord's rear guard. He began to enumerate items on his soot-blackened fingers, each a financial blow. Lances, you think they are simple wood. Each must be straight-grained ash, seasoned for years, balanced precisely. You need a wagon load for a campaign. They are not weapons, they are consumables. One solid hit and they shiver to splinters. A single joust can burn through a year's worth. Swords, a good blade takes a master smith months. It can snap, it can bend, it loses its edge after butchering a few mail-clad men and needs constant, expert sharpening, more coin. Sir Thomas listened, his face a mask in the flickering light. But within, a silent, familiar tally began. He mentally reviewed his own stables, the aging destrier, Roland, whose wind was not what it was, the 2 rounceys for squires, the pack animals. He calculated the cost of their feed, the farrier's visits, the new saddle needed just last year. He thought of the sheaf of lancers leaning in his barn, most of them older than Etienne, their wood possibly brittle. He saw the ledger entries in his mind's eye, the numbers bleeding red. And then you must pay the men, Hugh continued, his voice dropping as if sharing a grim secret. Your retinue. A knight is not a lone wolf. You need at least 2 squires, a page, 3 or 4 men-at-arms in decent mail, a groom who knows horses, their wages, their food, their kit. You must arm them, at least in part. You must house them. Their loyalty is purchased with silver and meat, not fine words. No lord will grant you land or favour if you arrive at his call with only a boy and your own shadow. The show of strength is itself a crippling expense. The armourer let the weight of that settle in the hot metallic air. Sir Thomas thought of the handful of souls in his own service. Their wages were a constant drain, their upkeep a quiet daily hemorrhage from his coffers. The performance of knighthood was a play staged on a foundation of ever-shifting debt. Hugh then gestured to Etienne, who had been standing quietly, wide-eyed. Come here, lad. The squire stepped forward, his youthful frame seeming slight in the workshop's oppressive atmosphere. Hugh picked up a simple curved piece of steel, a gorget meant to protect the throat and collarbones. He held it up to Etienne's neck without ceremony. It was too wide, the curve mismatched. See this, Hugh said, his voice losing none of its gravelly edge or fit. If I strap this to you, what happens? On the march, the lower edge rubs against your collarbone. After 10 miles, it chafes the skin raw. After 20, the wool of your gambeson is ground into an open wound. The wound festers, fever follows. I have seen strong men die from a gorget's rub, not a sword's kiss. He moved the metal slightly, demonstrating. Or worse, you take a fall from your horse or just slipping in mud. You land on your shoulder. A well-fitted gorget spreads the impact, deflects it. This, he tapped the ill-fitting steel. It focuses the force. Instead of sliding, it bites. It can snap your collarbone like a dry twig. Then you are not a knight. You are a cripple with one useless arm, and your armour, the very thing you paid for to save you, has broken you itself. He set the gorget down and fetched a knotted string, taking rough measurements of Etienne's neck and shoulders. his thick fingers surprisingly deft. Fit is not about comfort, boy. It is about survival. The difference between a bruise and a break, between a chafe and a gangrenous wound. Your armor must be a second skin, but skin that does not give, does not breathe. The only forgiveness is in its precision. Without that, you carry your own torture device and your own executioner into battle. Sir Thomas watched the measuring string, seeing not just Etienne's dimensions being taken, but the exacting expensive process of commissioning a single piece, another entry for the mental ledger. Hugh's lesson had come full circle, from the macroscopic ruin of the knightly enterprise down to the microscopic, brutal importance of a single curve of steel against a young man's throat. The proto armor was a system of catastrophic financial pressure and intimate physical peril, a prison whose walls were forged from debt and whose bars could, with the slightest imperfection, become the instruments of your own destruction. The forge's heat felt suddenly suffocating, a physical manifestation of the inescapable, grinding cost of it all. Rain fell not in drops, but in a relentless grey veil, a ceaseless murmur that was the world's only voice. It soaked through the thickest wool cloak until the fabric hung like a leaden second skin, cold and heavy across the shoulders. It found every gap, the join between hood and helmet, the space above a gauntlet's cuff, tracing icy paths down arms and backs, beneath the hooves of the destriers and the trudging feet of the men-at-arms. The road had surrendered entirely, becoming a ribbon of thick, sucking mud that clung to boots and fetlocks with a greedy, persistent hunger. Sir Thomas rode at the head of his small company, the rhythmic, plodding gait of his horse transmitting a dull, percussive ache up through the saddle and into the base of his spine. Each jolt was a fresh reminder of every old injury, a symphony of complaints from knee, hip, and shoulder. The rain dripped from the brim of his helmet in a steady, maddening cadence, a liquid clock marking the passage of interminable time. He had long since given up wiping the visor clear. The world was a blur of grey-green misery, the line between sky and land dissolved into a wet, amorphous gloom. The sound was a monotony of wetness, the squelch thud of each step, the heavy plop of mud falling from a lifted hoof, the constant patter on steel and leather. The wool of his cloak, saturated, smelled like a drowned sheep. Beneath his armor, his gambeson was damp with a mixture of rain and sweat, a clammy, chill layer that would not warm. The march had a slow, rhythmic, hypnotic quality, a forced meditation on discomfort. There was no conversation. Men conserved their energy, heads bowed against the weather, each locked in the private prison of his own misery. They passed through a narrow valley, and the land told an older, drier story. To their left, a gentle slope was littered, not with stones, but with shapes that were too regular, too pale, a picked clean battlefield. Rain had washed the last dark stains from the scattered bones, leaving them gleaming like ivory shards against the mud. A shattered skull, grass growing through an eye socket, a rib cage, half sunk into the earth, forming a small, grim cairn, a few scraps of boiled leather, a rusted buckle, the splintered haft of a spear standing at a forlorn angle. No crows bothered with this harvest now. It was too old. The silence here was different, deeper than the rain hush, a vacuum where life had been violently scooped away. It was a mute reminder that the war was not an event, but a condition of the land, a rot in the season. The company moved past it without a word, but shoulders seemed to tighten, and men glanced sideways, their own fatigue momentarily overshadowed by the chill of this permanent, open grave. The pace was agonizingly slow, dictated by the mud and the laden pack animals. It was a pace that did not numb the mind, but rather emptied it, leaving room only for the raw data of sensation, the itch of wet wool on the neck, the cramp in the thighs from gripping the saddle, the raw spot on his heel where a boot had rubbed. Sir Thomas's thoughts moved in slow, heavy circles, like his horse's plodding steps. He thought of the distance still to cover, of the state of the supplies in the wagons, of the damp threatening his bowstrings and the flour sacks. He did not think of glory or cause. Such concepts were too abstract, too lightweight to survive in this sodden reality. The only philosophy here was endurance. The only goal was to keep moving, to prevent the cold from settling into the bones, to reach a place, any place, where they might stop. Hours bled together, marked only by the gradual deepening of the grey light towards dusk. The rain did not cease. It became the universe. The company was a chain of dark, hunched shapes in a world of water and mud, a procession of profound fatigue. The march was not a journey towards anything, but a trial in itself, a slow, grinding attrition of spirit and body. Each mile was a victory over inertia, paid for in aching muscles and chilled marrow. Sir Thomas shifted his weight in the saddle, a minor adjustment that sent a fresh spike of pain through his hip. He looked ahead into the weeping grey and saw only more of the same. The road unspooled before them, a river of mire, and they were bound to follow its course. Minute by sodden minute, bearing the weight of the weather and the silent weight of the bones they passed, moving forward only because the alternative, to stop, was a deeper, more chilling misery. The camp was not a place of rest, but a surrender to the mud. They halted where the road widened into a treeless morass, a sea of churned, chocolate-brown filth that grasped at boots and tent pegs with equal indifference. The rain had eased to a miserable drizzle, but the damage was done. Every action was a battle against the sucking earth. Men moved with the slow, deliberate exhaustion of creatures half drowned, their movements accompanied by the wet, protesting sounds of mud. The first and most immediate misery was the trench, dug at the far edge of the camp, downwind in theory. It was a shallow gash in the earth that quickly filled with murky water. Its purpose was unmistakable, announced long before sight by a thick, gagging stench that cut through the damp air, a sweet, putrid odor of human waste and decay. A visible cloud of flies, undeterred by the cool weather, hung over it in a buzzing, shifting veil. The men used it quickly, faces averted, holding their breath as if diving into foul water. The mud around its edges was treacherous and stained. This was field sanitation, a raw, open wound in the earth that served as a blunt reminder of the body's basest needs and the collective filth of 100 men. Water was another trial. The nearby stream, promised by the scout, was a sluggish brown ribbon, its banks trampled into bogs by livestock. Filling the water skin meant wading through icy muck, the silt swirling up to cloud the water further. It would be boiled for pottage, but the taste of earth and the faint metallic hint of the trench's seepage would remain. Nothing was clean. Mud was the universal contaminant, in the food, under the fingernails, ground into the wool of every garment. Sir Thomas found a marginally less sodden patch of ground, and sat on a folded cloak, his back against a supply wagon. With stiff, cold fingers, he worked at the laces of his boots. The leather was swollen tight, resisting. Finally, he pulled them off. Then the thick, sodden, woolen hose beneath. His feet were pale, wrinkled, and ice-cold. He examined them with the clinical focus of a physician. turning them towards the faint grey light. Between the toes, the skin was red and tender, the beginnings of rot, the soldier's silent, creeping enemy. He rubbed them briskly with a piece of dryish cloth from his pack, trying to restore circulation. Feeling the painful prickling as blood returned, he would need to dry his hose by the fire, if a fire could be coaxed from the damp wood. It was a constant, vigilant battle. Keep the feet dry, or lose the ability to walk, to stand, to be a knight. The meal, when it came, was a testament to edible endurance. A shared cauldron yielded a thin grey pottage of boiled grain, peas, and a few scraps of salt pork. It was flavourless and lukewarm, eaten from wooden bowls that felt gritty with residual mud. It sat in the stomach like a lump of cold clay, providing bulk but no comfort, no warmth. Men ate in silence, hunched over their bowls, protecting them from the drizzle. As full dark fell, a pitiful fire was conjured from splintered, resinous pine, its smoke thick and acrid. Fighting the damp, it provided more light than heat, a flickering circle that pushed back the oppressive blackness only a few feet. Sir Thomas shared a tent with Hugh and two of the men-at-arms. The space was cramped, the air thick with the smell of wet wool, unwashed bodies, and damp hearth. They lay on ground sheets, but the moisture seeped up relentlessly, a deep chill that no blanket could fully thwart. Body heat was shared, but it was a damp, clammy communion, offering little real comfort. The close quarters meant every shift, every cough, every snore was transmitted through the tight space. It was an intimacy born of misery, not fellowship. His turn at the listening post came in the deepest part of the night. He took his place at the edge of the camp, where the firelight died and the forest began. He wore his cloak over his mail, but the cold was a penetrating force, finding every seam. The drizzle had stopped, leaving a crystalline, biting chill in the air. The world was utterly black and silent, a void, but as his ears adjusted, the silence fractured into 1,000 tiny, threatening sounds. The drip of water from a leaf, the rustle of some small creature in the underbrush, the creak of a tree, limb. Each one was amplified by the darkness and the loneliness of the vigil. His hand rested on the pommel of his sword. Every nerve was taut. Was that rustle a foraging badger or a scout's careful footfall? Was that snap of a twig a deer or the first signal of an ambush? The mind, deprived of sight, painted horrors in the ink-black hair. The cold seeped into his bones, a slow, static agony. Time stretched, elastic and cruel. This was the true watch, not a heroic stance against seen foes, but a psychological trial in the dark, a battle against the jump of one's own nerves and the crushing, cold loneliness of the hour. He stared into the nothingness, every sense screaming, a man reduced to a listening shell, waiting for a sound that would mean his death, or for the slow, blessed light of a dawn that felt an eternity away. The chapel was a hollowed-out tooth in the castle's gunline, a small, windowless space carved from the same damp grey stone as the walls. It held no grandeur, only a profound, settled chill that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock. The air was a still broth of smells, the wet, mineral breath of the stone, the faint, honeyed ghost of beeswax from the single candle upon the plain altar, and beneath it all, the musty odour of old prayer books and despair. The candle's flame did not dance. It burned straight and thin, a trembling needle of light in the vast cold dark. Sir Thomas knelt on the hard, unforgiving stone of the prie-dieu, the wood digging into his knees through his hose. He had removed his gauntlets, and his bare hands, rough and scarred, were clasped before him. The cold of the chapel seeped through his gambazon and mail, a deeper, more patient cold than that of the march, one that sought the core. Before him, in the shadow beyond the candle's reach, sat Brother Martin on a simple stool. The monk was a wraith of a man, his face pale and lean within his brown cowl, his eyes dark pools that seemed to absorb the scant light rather than reflect it. This was not the confessional of great dramatic sins, of murder, of treachery, of grand blasphemy. Those would have been almost a relief, a clean, definable darkness. What Sir Thomas laid bare was the grime that accumulated in the soul's crevices through daily living. His voice was a low, weary murmur, barely disturbing the stagnant air. He spoke of the hot, unnightly rage that had boiled in him 2 days prior when a wealthier, less competent knight had been given command of the vanguard. A rage so pure he had bitten the inside of his cheek until he tasted blood to keep from speaking it. He confessed the green worm-like twist of envy. He felt upon seeing another Lord's new Milanese plate, envy that was less for the steel itself and for the financial ease it represented, a freedom from Hugh's relentless ledgers. And finally, the heaviest sin, the one that felt closest to heresy, the crushing soul-deep weariness with duty itself, the feeling that the weight of the armor, the obligations to Lord and men, the very code he was sworn to uphold, were not a noble burden, but a millstone, and he was the donkey walking an endless circular track. Brother Martin listened in utter stillness, his breath making no plume in the cold. When Sir Thomas finished, the silence that followed was thick, a third presence in the chapel. The monk's words, when they came, were soft, measured, and carried the weight of doctrine. He offered the formula of absolution, the Latin phrases flowing like a gentle cleansing stream. For a moment, the ritual was a comfort. The words were ancient, impersonal, a machinery of grace that operated regardless of the petty, grinding nature of the sins fed into it. A weight seemed to lighten, a stone briefly lifted from his chest. But then Brother Martin continued, his voice dropping into a tone of grave reinforcement. These feelings, my son, are the chaff of the spirit, winnowed by the daily threshing of your station. Your rage at injustice is a fire that must be banked to warm your resolve, not burn your patience. Your envy is a reminder that your treasures are stored not in arsenals, but in heaven. Your weariness, here the monk paused, choosing his words with care. Your weariness is the fatigue of the soul carrying its cross. The duty of a knight is a prayer in action. Each march, each watch, each act of leadership offered, not for earthly gain, but for the order God has ordained, is a bead upon the rosary of service. To feel the weight is not to fail. It is to prove you are carrying it. The comfort curdled, transforming into a new kind of burden. The absolution had been for the sins, but the reinforcement was for the structure that produced them. His spiritual debts, it seemed, were as meticulously tracked as his financial ones. The rage, the envy, the weariness were not flaws to be excised, but taxes to be paid on the estate of his soul, perpetual rents owed to the divine landlord for the privilege of his station. The ritual meant to unshackle, had instead tightened the cinch, reminding him that his duty was not just to man, but to God, and that divine accounting was infinitely more stringent. He was a debtor on 2 fronts, and the chapel, for all its promise of peace, felt like another creditor's chamber, its its cold stone walls an echo of the unyielding laws that bound him. He crossed himself, the gesture automatic. The candle flame wavered as he stood, his joints protesting the cold and the hard kneeling. Brother Martin gave a faint benedictory nod, his face receding back into the shadow. Sir Thomas turned and walked toward the chapel's low archway, the sound of his mail a soft metallic sigh in the quiet. He stepped from the scent of beeswax and stone back into the castle's corridor, where the air smelled of damp rushes and cooking smoke. The spiritual ledger had been reviewed, a temporary credit extended, but the fundamental debt remained. A cold, silent companion, now walking beside him, as tangible as the ever-present ache in his bones. The hall was a cavern of false warmth and deafening noise. 100 candles swam in their own grease, their light shimmering off polished silver and the sweat on flushed faces, yet failing to reach the high, shadowed rafters where old banners hung like forgotten ghosts. The heat was a solid, woolen blanket, thick with the smells of roasted meat, spilled wine, and the cloying sweetness of perfumes dabbed over unwashed skin. Sir Thomas stood within it, a statue of profound discomfort, his body encased not in steel, but in a subtler, more galling prison. His finest tunic, of deep Lincoln green wool, was a masterpiece of constriction. The sleeves were too tight, cutting into the muscles of his upper arms, a legacy of a younger, broader frame. The high collar, embroidered with thread of gold that had long since lost its luster, chafed his neck with every forced swallow. The power than there. Garment had been pulled from a chest where it lay folded with dried lavender, but no herb could mask its age. The slight fray at the cuffs, the way the dye had faded unevenly across the shoulders from some past sun. It was a costume of status, worn thin by the very obligation it proclaimed. Beneath it, his skin itched, and the memory of his comfortable stained capped shirt was a poignant, distant luxury. He held a silver-chased goblet, its weight a mockery, for it contained only a thin, sour local wine. A smile was fixed upon his face, a rigid muscle memory, as polished as his seldom-worn dress dagger. It was a tool, like a shield, angled to deflect and to present an acceptable surface. He moved through the throng, a slow navigation through a human sea of velvet and silk, his eyes missing nothing. Here, Baron de Courcy held court, his laughter too loud, his hand resting on the shoulder of a younger knight whose father owned fertile riverlands. There the Chancellor's secretary held a quiet, intense conversation with a merchant in Flemish wool, their heads close together. Every interaction was a transaction, a delicate adjustment of the scales of favour and future advantage. Sir Thomas found himself before Lord Mowbray, the feast's host, a man with a florid face and eyes like chips of flint. He bowed, the motion making the tight tunic pull across his back. "My lord," he said, his voice carefully modulated to blend respect with a hint of martial solidity. "Your hall does you great honour. Such bounty speaks of a land's well kept and a people content." The words were hollow as a rotten nut, a formulaic compliment he had uttered in a dozen different halls to a dozen different lords. Mowbray's lands were notoriously overtaxed and poorly managed, but the fiction was required. Currency. The lord nodded, accepting the tribute as his due, his gaze already sliding past Sir Thomas to a richer, more consequential guest. The moment's purpose was served, a presence acknowledged, a loyalty signalled, a name kept from slipping entirely from the patron's mind. It was networking as survival, a bare-knuckled scramble for the crumbs of patronage that might one day cover a debt or secure a minor favor, he turned, and the rich food, which had seemed so glorious after weeks of camp pottage, sat in his stomach like a ball of lead. He had eaten roasted capon, glazed with honey, a slice of spiced boar, a marchpane subtlety shaped like a castle. Each rich, greasy mouthful had been a contrast to the memory of bland grain and muddy water, a dissonance that now churned within him. His body, accustomed to lean rations, rebelled against the sudden fat and spice. A faint, acidic heat rose in his throat. He sipped the bad wine to quell it, the sourness only compounding the unease. From the edge of the press, he watched the younger knights. He saw Etienne, his own squire, clutching a goblet too tightly, his face a mask of earnest anxiety as he attempted to converse with a grizzled old captain of archers. The boy's compliments were too effusive, his laughter at a joke arriving a beat too late. Sir Thomas saw the captain's polite, dismissive smile. He recognized the clumsy machinery of it all, the desperate desire to be seen, to attach one's fortunes to a rising star or a sturdy oak. He saw his own past self in that anxious posture, a young knight believing that merit and courage were the keys to the inner circles, slowly learning that the true keys were silver, land, and the deft, soulless performance of flattery. The sight filled him not with contempt, but with a weary, paternal pity. He watched as Etienne was gently but firmly steered aside by the arrival of a knight with newer, more fashionable sleeves, a lesson in precedence, delivered without a word spoken. The feast was a performance, and every soul in the hall was a player, reciting lines written by birth and avarice. The minstrels in the gallery played a lively estampire, but the music was just another layer of noise, a sound to shout over. The laughter was too sharp, the conversations too loud, all straining to convey an ease and prosperity that few truly felt. For Sir Thomas, the exhaustion was deeper than any march. It was the fatigue of the spirit, of maintaining the fiction of his place. The candlelight gleamed on the gold thread at his neck, a tiny mocking glint of a wealth he did not possess. The tight tunic was a constant reminder of the strain of appearances, of the relentless financial pressure that demanded he look the part of a prosperous knight even as his purse grew lighter, with every necessary show of false prosperity. He stood amidst the false cheer and the clatter of plates, a man starving at a banquet, bearing the weight of his empty smile and the crushing, invisible cost of the obligation to wear it. The scream tore the night in two. It was not a human sound, but the raw, metallic shriek of a horn, a blade of noise that sliced through the deep, exhausted silence of the camp. Sir Thomas was on his feet before his mind had fully surfaced from sleep. A reaction hammered into his bones. The world was a chaos of sudden violent motion. Men erupted from their tents like startled beetles, scrambling for weapons, shouting questions that were lost in the panicked din. The darkness, once a blanket, was now a hostile medium, full of stumbling shapes and the glint of hastily grabbed steel. The cold air burned in his lungs as he fumbled for his sword belt, his fingers thick with sleep, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. But as he stumbled from his tent, the muddy ground uncertain under his boots, the present alarm began to warp and bleed. The shouting voices blurred, merging into a different, more terrible roar. The campfire's erratic light became the hellish, dancing glow of burning thatch. The smell of damp earth and cold ashes transformed into the stench of smoke, spilled blood, and open bowels. The present fell away, and he was thrust backwards, not in memory, but in relived sensation, into the meat-grinded chaos of St. Albans Field. The noise first, a physical wall of it that pressed on the ears and vibrated in the teeth, not individual shouts, but a continuous bestial thunder of men screaming, horses shrieking, steel ringing on steel, the wet thump of impacts on flesh and wood. It was deafening. A force that stripped away thought, reducing the world to pure, adrenal instinct. He was in the press, the line of men, a sweating, heaving wall at his back and side. The air was thick with dust and the coppery tang of blood. He could not see clearly, just flashes. A snarling face behind a visor, a banner dipping and falling, a spray of crimson against the summer sky, then the blow. A shape detached itself from the murk, a hulking man-at-arms, wielding a spiked mace. There was no time for technique, only raw survival. Sir Thomas raised his shield, the old heavy kite shield he had carried then. The mace descended in a short, brutal arc. The impact was not a clean ring, but a shocking, jarring crack that travelled up his arm and slammed into his shoulder socket with the force of a falling tree. The sound was of splintering wood. The corda, shield's edge buckling inward. His entire left side went numb for a terrifying second, a white flash of pain, blinding his mind's eye. He staggered, the world tilting, his boots slipping on blood-slicked grass. And then he saw it. To his right, young Robert de Clare, who had shared his wine just that morning, who had laughed about a girl in the village. A poleaxe, swung by a dismounted man-at-arms, caught Robert on the side of the helm. It was not a clean cut. The blade bit, stuck, and was wrenched free in a grotesque, twisting motion. The helm crumpled like parchment, and with it, the skull within. Robert did not fall gracefully. He collapsed like a sack of wet grain, his limbs splaying, but it was the aftermath that was seared into Sir Thomas's sight. The ruin of the head, the shocking, vivid mess of it. The way the bright, eager life that had animated the face just moments before was now so utterly, messily absent. It was not a death in a song. It was a butcher's work. Inelegant and final, the image imprinted itself. A raw, red stamp on his soul. In the camp, someone jostled him hard, bringing him back to the cold, muddy present. He gasped, the air of the night sharp in his throat. He was standing frozen, his sword half drawn, his body braced for a blow that had fallen years ago. Around him, the panic was subsiding into confused murmurs. The alarm had been false, a sentry's nerves, a startled deer in the wood. But for Sir Thomas, the transition was not clean. The ghost of the battle clung to him, its sensory imprint overlaid on the real world. The thudding of his own heart was the war drum of the melee. The rough texture of his sword grip was the feel of his splintered shield strap. The cold sweat on his back was the heat of that distant, bloody afternoon. He slowly sheathed his sword, his hands trembling, not from the night's chill, but from the aftershock of remembered terror. This was the true ghost that haunted him, not a spectre in a shroud, but a perfect, visceral echo of trauma that could be summoned by a sudden noise, a certain smell, a stumble in the dark. It lingered beneath the surface of his discipline, like a buried fault line, waiting for a tremor to split him open. It was why sleep was often a treacherous country, why the quiet moments could be the most dangerous, why the peace he ostensibly fought for felt like a fragile skin over a never-closed wound. The camp settled back into an uneasy quiet, men returning to their tents with muttered curses and nervous laughter. But Sir Thomas remained standing in the mud, staring into the black woods, seeing not trees, but the contorted face of a dead friend, feeling not the night air, but the shocking bone-deep jar of a mace that had, in truth, shattered a piece of him forever. The alarm was over, but the battle within him, the ghost in his nerves, raged on, silent and ceaseless. The camp settled like a pond after a thrown stone, the concentric rings of panic slowly fading into a tense, watchful stillness. The sentry's face was pale with shame in the guttering torchlight as he muttered about shadows and a deer's sudden bolt. Men returned to their tents, their movements sluggish with spent adrenaline, the false alarm leaving a residue of frayed nerves and hollow embarrassment. Sir Thomas stood for a long moment, the phantom shock of the mace blow still vibrating in his bones, the image of Robert's shattered helm superimposed on the dark trunks of the trees. Then, with a slow exhalation that misted in the cold air, he turned. He found Hugh and Etienne near the rekindled fire. The armourer was poking the embers with a stick, his face a mask of grim practicality, but his shoulders were hunched tighter than usual. Etienne sat on a log, his hands clasped between his knees, trembling slightly. The young man's eyes were wide, the pupils still dilated from fear, but also from the raw, unvarnished glimpse of his own mortality. The romantic veil had been torn, and the abyss had stared back. Sir Thomas lowered himself stiffly onto a nearby crate, the wood groaning under his weight, and the mail. The three of them formed a small island in the quiet dark, the firelight carving their faces from the night. For a time, no one spoke. The silence was not comfortable, but it was shared. It was the quiet of men who had all, in their own way, just visited a private hell. Hugh finally broke it, his voice a low rumble that seemed to rise from the earth itself. "Songs," he grunted, tossing his stick into the flames. "They sing of lines of bright steel, of noble charges, of single combats under God's eye." He spat into the mud near the fire. "Lies, all of it, clean lies." Sir Thomas stared into the flames, seeing not wood, but the chaotic press of bodies at Saint. "I'll burns it is noise," he said, his own voice sounding distant to his ears. "A wall of it. You cannot hear orders. You cannot think. You become an animal, pushing, hitting, trying not to slip on the wet grass." He did not say blood. He did not need to. Etienne flinched almost imperceptibly. Hugh nodded, his eyes reflecting the fire like chips of obsidian. "And luck, the great, unspoken truth. It is not the best knight who lives, but the luckiest. The arrow that finds the gap in your visor is no respecter of valor. The horse that falls left instead of right. The friend who steps in front of the poleaxe meant for you." He glanced at Sir Thomas, and in that look was an entire history of near misses and fallen comrades. You survive by chance. You carry that chance like a debt you can never repay. Etienne's voice was small, a thread of sound. "And the killing, sir?" Sir Thomas was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled, consuming the air. "You do not duel," he said finally. Each word weighed. "You do not exchange fine strokes. In the press, you kill a man who is trying to kill you, and you do it as quickly and as messily as you can. An elbow to the throat, a dagger under the arm, a hack at the back of the knee. There is no honor in the act, only necessity." And afterward, he trailed off, his gaze turning inward. "Afterward, you see his face. Not the snarling mask, but the face he might have had in peace. You wonder if he had a wife, a child, a field he preferred to this mud. The guilt is a cold stone in your gut. It does not go away. It sinks, and you build your life on top of it." Hugh gave a bitter, bark-like laugh. And then, if you are lucky and strong, you take a prisoner, and the song ends there with the noble capture. But the truth, he leaned forward, the firelight deepening the crevices of his face. The truth is the scramble, the undignified, greedy scramble over a wounded man to be the first to claim his ransom, arguing over his worth while he bleeds at your feet, haggling with his family like a fishwife over the price of his life. That is the prize, boy, not glory, coin. The very coin that keeps this miserable show on the road. The words hung in the cold air, stripping the night bare. Etienne looked between them, the last of his boyish illusions crumbling to ash. He had trained for the tournament of war, for a world governed by a bright, clear code. What they described was a slaughterhouse governed by chaos, luck, and commerce. Sir Thomas felt the weight of the code of chivalry then, not as a guiding light, but as a distant, brittle script written on parchment that had never seen rain or blood. It spoke of courtesy, of protecting the weak, of fair combat. It had no language for the deafening cacophony, for the visceral terror that turned bowels to water, for the pragmatic butchery required to survive, for the shameful, desperate grab for money that followed. The code was a castle in the air, beautiful and ordered. Their lives were the muddy field upon which it was supposed to stand, a field churned by fear, swimming in gore, and littered with the broken promises of a nobility that existed only in minstrels' tales. The fire burned lower. The camp around them was asleep again, or pretending to be. The ghost of the false alarm had been banished, but a more profound spectre had taken its place. The ghost of truth. It sat with them by the fire, this understanding of what they were and what they did, shorn of all ornament. It was a colder companion than fear. Sir Thomas looked at his hands, scarred and capable of both prayer and butchery, then at the young squire, whose innocence had just been sacrificed, and finally at the armourer, whose craft sustained the entire grim enterprise. They were bound together not by the glittering ideals of chivalry, but by the shared muddy, bloody truth of its practice, a truth that was heavier than any armour, and far more difficult to bear. The Manor Solar was a tomb of quiet, a stark contrast to the remembered din of the feast, and the phantom clamour of battle. The only light was a single tallow candle, its flame a small, desperate sun in the vast cold darkness. It cast a trembling circle on the scarred surface of the oak table, illuminating the vellum pages of Sir Thomas's ledger, the rest of the room, the shadowed tapestry, the empty hearth, the chest holding his patched finery, retreated into gloom. Here, in this silent hour, he waged his most constant and least honourable war, the war of arithmetic. His quill was a lance in his aching hand. The ink was thin, mixed from soot and gum, a poor man's black. He did not write in the flowing script of a clerk, but in a blunt, functional hand, each stroke an effort. The entries were not a chronicle of deeds, but a litany of hemorrhage. He began with the credits, the meagre trickle of income. Michael must rent the demesnes of Haysham, 12 shillings, 8 pence. Sale of 3 sacks of wool, clipped from the manor's flock, 9 shillings. The numbers looked pitiful, even as he formed them, a shallow well against a desert of need. Then the debits. Each one was a weight added to the scale, dragging it downward. To Hugh, armourer, for repair of pauldron, and Grieve, and for 1 new lance, 3 shillings, 4 pence. The memory of the forge's heat and Hugh's grim lesson was in that sum. For feed, oats for the destrier Roland, hay for the Rounceys through the winter months, 8 shillings. The animals were not companions, but capital, their hunger, a relentless, masticating clock. Wages to William and John, men-at-arms, for a quarter year. 6 shillings. To the groom, Martin, 2 shillings. To the boy, Peter, 1 shilling. A constellation of dependencies, each a small, regular drain on his dwindling silver. He turned the page, the vellum crackling like a dry leaf. The entries grew larger, more ominous. To Lord Mowbray, for the fee of marriage, 2nd instalment, due at Easter, 40 shillings. The right to wed. His wife, Eleanor, to secure his line and his tenancy, had been purchased on credit, a debt to his liege lord that hung over him like a sword. He had stood in Mowbray's hall, smiling his tight smile, while this particular chain was fitted around his neck, promised donation to the Abbey of St. Ansel for the upkeep of the chantry, and prayers for my father's soul. 20 shillings, a spiritual debt, contracted in a moment of grief and piety, now a financial millstone. The church's ledger, he knew, was kept by angels with the hearts of tax collectors. His income was not just meagre, it was a fickle, untrustworthy thing. The rents from Haitian depended on the tenants' harvests, which depended on the weather, which was God's alone, to grant or withhold. Last year the spring rains had been too heavy, the summer sun too weak. The rents had come in short, and he had forgiven the difference, knowing the alternative was to drive good men from the land and let the fields go fallow, which would profit no one. The wool price fluctuated with the whims of Flemish merchants and the health of distant flocks. There was no certainty, only a precarious balancing act on a ledge of damp, crumbling stone. He tallied the columns, his lips moving silently. The debits dwarfed the credits. The gap was a yawning chasm. He knew what it meant. Another letter of pleading to Mowbray, begging for time. The sale of something, perhaps the silver-chased goblet from the feast, a hollow symbol of a status he could not afford. A reduction in the household's already lean fare. The postponement of necessary repairs to the manor's roof, which would only grow more costly. Each decision was a small defeat, a compromise that chipped away at the substance of his knighthood. Honour was not a pure flame burning in the heart. It was a commodity, its brightness directly proportional to the weight of silver in one's purse. A knight who could not maintain his horse, arm his men, or fulfill his obligations to lord and church was a knight in name only, a shell emptier than his discarded armour. The candle guttered, a long tongue of wax flowing down its side and hardening like a pale scar. The flame dimmed, and the circle of light shrank, pressing the darkness closer. Sir Thomas set down the quill, his fingers stiff. He did not need to see the final, damning, total. He felt it in the cold of the room, in the ache in his shoulders, in the weary resignation that was his most constant companion. The ledger was not just an account of money, it was the anatomy of his station, laying bare the brittle bones of economics upon which the flesh of honour was stretched so thinly. One poor harvest, one broken lance at the wrong moment, one unexpected demand from his lord, and the whole precarious structure would collapse. He was a man forever on the brink, his valour, his loyalty, his very identity held hostage by a column of figures in cheap ink. He closed the ledger, the soft thud, a funeral knell for the day. The candle flame fought on, a tiny futile defiance against the immense calculating dart. The misery was not a single sharp agony, but a chorus of low, constant complaints, a symphony of itch and ache played upon the living instrument of his body. After days encased, the armour became more than a shell. It was a breeding ground for discomfort, a mobile ecosystem of filth and irritation. The heat rash began first, a fiery, prickling bloom across his shoulders and lower back, where the gambeson, perpetually damp with sweat, chafed against skin never allowed to dry. It was a maddening, crawling sensation, 1,000 tiny pins pricking just beneath the surface, utterly unreachable beneath layers of quilted linen and interlocked iron. Then came the lice. They were an inevitable colonization, travelling from man to man in the close quarters of the march and the camp. They nested in the thick wool of his arming cap, their minute bites a constellation of fiery points across his scalp. They ventured into his beard, a wiry forest offering perfect cover, their movement a ghostly skittering torment along his jaw and neck. At night, in the tent, he would feel them marching, a tiny persistent army, claiming his body as their territory. Scratching was a futile, desperate gesture. The gauntlets were too clumsy, and fingernails against mail only produced a dull, unsatisfying scrape. The itch became a background hum to every thought, a physical manifestation of the body's rebellion against its metallic carapace. The opportunity for relief, when it came, was a brutal kind of mercy. They found a shallow, stony stretch of a stream, its water snow-melt cold and clear over a bed of rounded pebbles. Sir Thomas stood on the bank while Etienne worked at the buckles and points, the armour coming off in reverse order. First the stifling helm, the cold air a shock on his sweaty, louse-ridden hair, then the pauldrons and cuirass. The sudden lack of pressure on his chest, making him gasp as if emerging from deep water. Piece by piece, the weight was lifted, but the body revealed was a pathetic sight. His linen underclothes were stained dark with old sweat and grime, plastered to his skin. The gambeson, when peeled off, released a thick animal odour. He waded into the stream. The cold was a violence, stealing his breath, tightening his skin into gooseflesh. He used a handful of gritty sand and a strip of rough linen to scrub at his arms, his chest, his neck. The grime was not merely on the surface, it was ingrained, ground into the pores by days of friction and heat. The sand abraded his skin, turning it pink and raw. But the feeling of filth being scraped away was a profound, almost spiritual relief. He submerged his head, the icy water shocking his scalp, and rubbed fiercely at his hair and beard, hoping to drown or dislodge the colonies of vermin. The water around him clouded with dirt and old oil. On the bank, the squires set to their own sacred duty. Etienne and the other young men laid out the discarded pieces of armour on cloaks. They took stiff brushes and rags, scouring the steel of mud, of the white, salty crust of dried sweat, of the first faint specks of rust that had already begun to kiss the metal. They worked oil into the joints of the polanes and carters, their movements reverent and methodical. This was not a cleaning for show, but a desperate maintenance, a holding action against entropy and decay. The filth they removed was the physical residue of the march, of the body's slow rebellion. The armour, once cleaned, gleamed dully in the grey light, but it was a transient purity, a brief interlude before it would be donned again to accumulate fresh misery. Sir Thomas emerged from the stream shuddering, his skin clean, but screaming from the cold and the abrasion. He dried himself with a coarse blanket, the rough texture a fresh irritation on his abraded skin. He pulled on a clean, dry set of underclothes from his pack, a luxury of short duration, and then a fresh gambeson. The clean linen felt startlingly soft, a whisper against his raw skin. For a few precious moments, he was a man, not a machine of war. The relentless itch was soothed. The weight was gone. He could draw a full, unconstricted breath, but the relief was achingly temporary. He looked at the armor laid out on the bank, being methodically restored by the squires. It awaited him. The clean underclothes would soon be soaked anew. The scrubbed skin would again fester beneath padding. The lice, only temporarily inconvenienced, would regroup. This was the cycle. A brief, brutal baptism, followed by the inevitable, slow descent back into the world of itch and ache and stench. The bath was not a cure, but a pause, a fleeting memory of comfort that made the return to discomfort all the more acute. It emphasized the perpetual, low-grade physical suffering that was the true baseline of his existence, a suffering as constant as the weight of the steel itself, an itch beneath a plate that could never be fully scratched, only endured until the next fleeting, cold and painful moment of respite. The world was a study in silver and shadow, a realm suspended between the sun's memory and its return. Sir Thomas stood on the castle's western wall, the stone cold and solid beneath his mailed feet. The watch was his, the last of the night, a duty he had taken without complaint, almost with relief. Here, in the absolute stillness, the frantic noise of the day and the phantom clamour of memory finally fell away, leaving only a vast, crystalline quiet. The full moon, round and pale as a worn coin, hung in a sky of deep violet velvet, its light so bright it washed the stars to faint specks. It poured over the landscape, transforming the familiar into something ethereal and strange. The sleeping camp below was a geometry of dark mounds and the faint red ember eyes of banked fires. Tents became silvered hillocks. Stacked pikes were a thicket of black needles against the song earth. Beyond the earthworks, the fields lay under a shimmering blanket of frost, each blade of grass individually edged in mercury. The forest at the valley's edge was a wall of indigo, its details lost, its presence a silent, breathing mass. In this profound silence, his own body announced itself with a new, unknowable clarity. Freed from the day's distractions, every ache stepped forward to claim his attention. The old lance wound in his shoulder was a deep, rhythmic throb, synchronized with his heartbeat. His lower back, perpetually compressed by the weight of the hauberk, was a knot of dull fire. His knees, stiff from cold and old injuries, felt like hinges rusted shut. The chill of the stone seeped through his sabatons, a patient, creeping cold that climbed his legs. He was a catalogue of past violence, each twinge a footnote to a forgotten skirmish, a bad fall, a decade of bearing weight. The armor he wore now felt less like protection and more like a frame holding the collection of his damages together. The quiet was not empty. It was layered. As his ears adjusted, the silence dissolved into a tapestry of minute, nocturnal sounds. The soft, intermittent crump of a settling ember in the camp below, the distant, lonely call of an owl from the wood, a question thrown into the void, the almost imperceptible scuttle of a mouse in the thatch of a nearby roof, the sigh of a light wind moving through the dry winter grass on the hillside, a sound like a gentle exhalation. These were the sounds of the world at rest, a rhythm older and more peaceful than the clangor of men. He heard the faint jingle of his own mail as he shifted his weight, the sound absurdly loud in the hush, a reminder of his own intrusive presence in this serene tableau. His gaze drifted over the camp, picking out the tents of his men. There Hugh would be snoring, a sound like a saw on green wood. There young Etienne slept, perhaps dreaming of the glory this quiet hour so thoroughly denied. He thought of them, and the weight of his responsibility settled upon him, a different kind of armor, equally constricting. Their lives, their meager pay, their trust, all were threads woven into a mantle of obligation he could never remove. One poor decision, one misjudgment in battle or in patronage, and the fragile web of their survival would tear. The pressure was a constant, low hum beneath all other thoughts, the bass note of his existence. And in the moonlit clarity, the dead returned, not as the violent ghosts of battle, but as quiet absences. He saw Robert declare faith, not in its final ruin, but as it was in life, laughing over a wineskin. He remembered the sound of another man's voice, a friend lost to fever, in a damp siege camp years ago. Their names, their voices, the space they once occupied. These were voids in the world, pockets of stillness within the greater stillness. He carried them, these quiet negatives, as surely as he carried his aches. Their memory was not a sharp grief, but a melancholic sediment that had settled at the bottom of his soul, stirred up by the calm. This was the calmest kind of misery. There was no immediate threat, no clamoring debt collector, no blaring horn. There was only the moon, the cold, the ache, and the vast silent weight of it all. The years behind, the obligations ahead, the lives in his charge, the faces gone. It was a misery so integrated it felt almost like peace for a moment. He was not a knight, a debtor, a commander. He was simply a man on a wall, a small, conscious node of pain and memory in a beautiful, indifferent, sleeping world. The pressure was there, the sadness was there, but they were held in suspension by the sheer, breathtaking quiet. He did not pray. He did not think. He simply existed within the feeling, the melancholic meditation of the quiet hours, until the first faint smear of grey began to bleed into the eastern sky, signaling the end of the watch and the return of the noisy, demanding world. The chapel's cold was an ancient, patient thing, having seeped into the stone over centuries of whispered penance and silent doubt. Sir Thomas knelt once more on the unforgiving wood of the prie-dieu, the same spot worn smooth by generations of burdened knees. The single candle on the altar, guttered in a draught, casting Brother Martin's gaunt face into shifting relief, making him appear less a man than a carved effigy, animated by flickering light. The smells were the same: damp stone, beeswax, the faint, sweet decay of old vellum. But the silence between them was different, heavier. It was the silence of a question too large for the small, cold room. Sir Thomas did not speak of specific sins this time. The grinding catalogue of envy, rage, and petty resentment felt like surface froth on a deeper still sea. What rose to his lips now was the sea itself, a profound and heretical exhaustion that seemed to leach the very meaning from his vows. His voice, when it finally came, was a dry rustle, the sound of a man emptying a hollow place within. "I am tired, brother." The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. "Not in my bones, though they ache, not in my flesh, though it is worn. I am tired in the place where purpose should reside. I put on the shell. I march. I fight when called. I smile at feasts. I tally my debts. I pray for forgiveness for my weariness of it all. And I do not see, I do not feel the shape of the meaning. Is this constant struggle a prayer, or is it merely a turning of a wheel, with no destination but the next turn? Where is the grace in this endless bearing? He fell silent, the confession leaving him feeling not unburdened, but exposed, as if he had opened his chest to show not a heart, but a cold, grey ash. The nightly life, with its interlocking weights of steel, duty and debt, stretched behind and ahead of him like an infinite, muddy road. The code of chivalry, the divine order, Brother Martin spoke of felt like a constellation seen through thick cloud. Theoretically present, but offering no navigational light for the trudging man below. Brother Martin did not react with shock or censure. His dark eyes, deep set in their sockets, regarded Sir Thomas with a calm that felt like another form of cold. He steepled his pale, thin fingers, the tips touching just below his lips. "The feeling you describe is not heresy, my son," he began, his voice a soft, measured monotone that seemed part of the chapel's ambient silence. "It is the dark night of the soul allotted to those who carry great burdens. To question is human, but to cease carrying because the burden is heavy, that is the sin." He leaned forward slightly, the candlelight catching the fine weave of his woolen habit. "You speak of purpose. Your purpose is not to feel purpose. Your purpose is to do your duty. Duty is the prayer, the aching lift of the sword, the weary vigilance on the wall, the patient hearing of a tenant's complaint. These are not means to an end. They are the liturgy itself. Each act, offered without the consolation of feeling its worth, is a purer form of devotion." He paused, letting the theology settle like frost. "Suffering is not an obstacle to grace. It is the path. The fatigue you feel, the existential drain, these are the fires that burn away the dross of self, of pride, of the expectation of reward when you serve not for glory, not for comfort, not even for the feeling of righteousness, but simply because it is your ordained place to serve. Then you approach true humility. Then you touch the hem of grace. The cold comfort you perceive in my words is the only comfort there is, the knowledge that your struggle, in its very pointlessness to your own heart, is meaningful in the eyes of God." The words were doctrinally sound, a fortress of logic built to withstand a siege of despair. Yet to Sir Thomas, they felt like being handed a beautifully drawn map of a desert while dying of thirst. The conflict was not between faith and faithlessness, but between the clean, ordered world of theology and the messy, aching reality of lived experience. Brother Martin spoke of duty as prayer, but Sir Thomas's daily prayer was a rasping breath inside a stifling helm, the prayer of a body pushed beyond its limits. A monk spoke of suffering as a purifying fire, but the fire Sir Thomas knew was the fever of an infected wound, the burning rash under his gambazon, the slow-consuming heat of financial anxiety. These were not metaphors, they were the gritty, undeniable facts of his existence, and they mocked the serene abstractions of spiritual counsel. He had come seeking a spark, a reason to continue shouldering the weight. He had been given a philosophical framework that justified the weight itself. It was a cold, stark comfort, like being told the chains were well forged and part of a divine plan. The spiritual drain was not alleviated. It was merely explained, categorized as a feature of his journey, rather than a flaw in his soul. He felt simultaneously absolved and imprisoned. The weariness was not a failing to be overcome, but a cross to be embraced, another item on the endless ledger of owed suffering. He bowed his head, not in acceptance, but in a fatigue so deep it mimicked reverence. The echoes in the chapel were not of his voice or the monks, but of the vast, lonely disconnect between the ideal and the real. His faith was a castle on a distant hill, its banners visible, but its halls inaccessible, separated from him by the swamp of daily misery through which he was condemned to march. Brother Martin's words were the castle's distant, unwavering bells, tolling a tune of order and purpose, but could not quite reach the man struggling in the mire below. The absolution he received felt like a seal on his exhaustion, a divine ratification of the endless struggle. He crossed himself, the gesture automatic, and rose, his joints protesting. He left the chapel, not fortified, but resigned, carrying with him the new, chilling knowledge that his profound sense of meaningless struggle was, in the eyes of heaven, perhaps its own form of meaning. The cold of the stones had entered him, a spiritual chill that no earthly fire could ever hope to thaw. The manor did not welcome him. It simply absorbed him back into its own quiet, crumbling narrative. The journey's end was not a conclusion, but a shift in the nature of the burden. Sir Thomas rode through the familiar gate, the hooves of his weary destrier clopping hollowly on the packed earth of the yard. The air was still and cold, carrying the scent of wood smoke from a single meagre hearth and the deeper, damp odour of neglected stone. The building itself seemed to sag under the weight of the grey sky, its timber upper story leaning slightly, like a tired man bowing his head. His squire, Etienne, took the horse, the boy's own relief at the journey's end, palpable. Sir Thomas dismounted stiffly, every ache from the march now a settled, familiar tenant in his joints. He stood for a moment, looking at his home. The thatch on the eastern wing was patched with darker straw, a clumsy repair. A persistent leak from a blocked gutter had traced a dark greenish stain down the whitewashed wall beneath an upper window, a scar of neglect. The place was not a ruin, but a patient, slow surrender to entropy, a mirror of his own gradual wearing down. He pushed open the heavy oak door to the hall. The space within was vast, shadowy and chill. The fire in the great hearth was a sparse, whispering thing, a clutch of glowing embers and a single, sullen log that gave more smoke than warmth. The flame's feeble light failed to reach the high, blackened beams, leaving the corners pooled in deep cold shadow. The rushes on the floor were old, their herbal scent long since replaced by a flat, dusty odour. The hall was not a place of warmth and gathering, but a cavern that stored the cold. His wife, Eleanor, emerged from the screen's passage. She moved with a careful, weary economy, her steps quiet on the stones. Her gown, once a fine blue, was faded and neat, but her face told a deeper story. The lines around her eyes and mouth were not just from age, but from the constant, low-grade strain of stewardship in his absence. Her smile as she greeted him was genuine, but it was a smile that had learned to hold fatigue within its curve. She took his cloak, her hands brushing his, and her touch was cool. In her eyes, he saw the silent tally of the months he had been gone. Decisions made alone, disputes settled, anxious calculations over, stores and silver. Her weariness was a different flavour from his own, but from the same bitter root. She spoke softly of the tenants. Old John at the mill was disputing the tolls again. The fence along the northern pasture was down, and sheep had strayed. The roof in the dairy shed leaked, threatening the winter cheese. Her words were not complaints, but a quiet, efficient transfer of responsibility, the passing of a baton. Each item was a small stone, and as she listed them, he felt them being placed, one by one, into the already heavy basket of his cares. The burdens of the field replaced by the burdens of the hearth, no less weighty for being domestic. He retreated to the small solar, the room where he kept his ledger. Here, the silence was even deeper. He began the ritual of divestment. Etienne helped him remove the armour, the pauldrons, the cuirass, the vambraces. Each piece was laid aside with a solid, metallic thud, the weight lifted from his body, the physical constriction easing. He shed the gambeson, the male hauberk, and stood finally in his stained underclothes, a man again, shivering in the unheated room. The metaphorical weight, however, did not dissipate. It settled around him differently, a cloak of quiet anxiety. The chill of the hall was not just in the air. It was in the knowledge of the leaking roof, the discontented tenants, the precarious balance of his accounts. It was the constant, low hum of financial worry, a cold companion that had taken up residence in the very stones of his home, and now wrapped itself around his bare shoulders. He dressed in a simple, worn tunic and hose, the fabrics familiar and forgiving, but the comfort was superficial. As he sat by the feeble fire in the hall later, a cup of thin ale in his hand, he felt no peace, no respite. The silence was not peaceful, but expectant. The manor creaked around him, a symphony of small complaints. Eleanor sat across from him, mending by the poor light, her needle moving in and out of the cloth with a quiet, persistent rhythm. There was affection here, a deep and abiding bond, forged in shared struggle, but there was no escape from the pressure. The war was elsewhere, but the siege was here, a slow, patient siege of obligations, of decay, of never having quite enough. Home was not a sanctuary. It was the central keep of his own personal fiefdom, and it was crumbling, demanding constant, wearying defense. He had removed the steel shell, but the weight remained, transformed into the very air he breathed, the cold hearth, the worried line on his wife's brow, the silent, endless accounting of a life lived on the edge of ruin. It began as a familiar, dull ache, the ghost of an old injury whispering from the past. A thick scar, pale and rope-like, traversed Sir Thomas's left calf, a souvenir of a Flemish pikeman's lucky thrust a decade prior. For years it had been a dormant landmark on his body, a ridge of numb tissue, but in the damp, unrelenting chill following his return, the ghost woke. The ache sharpened, becoming a hot, insistent throb. By the second morning, when he pulled off his hose, the sight made his breath catch. The scar itself was an angry, livid red, swollen, taut as a sausage casing. The flesh around it was inflamed, a spreading map of crimson and puce, hot to the touch. A faint, yellowish fluid beaded along the scar's length. This was no simple ache. This was the unseen enemy, but one that ignored armor and valor, declaring war from within. Medieval medicine arrived not with sterile precision, but with the grim, fragrant tools of tradition. Eleanor, her face set in a mask of calm concern, prepared the poultice. She mashed a foul-smelling paste of crushed garlic, honey, and the dried leaves of yarrow and comfrey, bound with rye flour and warm water. The mixture was slathered thickly onto a strip of clean linen. Sir Thomas lay on his bed, propped on bolsters, his leg exposed to the cold air of the chamber. The application was not gentle. The poultice, when laid upon the inflamed flesh, was a searing agony, a deep, burning counterpoint to the wound's own heat. He gritted his teeth, a low groan escaping him. The linen was then wrapped tightly, binding the medicinal muck to his leg, a soggy, pungent bandage. The smell filled the room, sweet honey undercut by the pungent reek of garlic and the green, crushed scent of herbs, a perfume of desperate hope. Prayers were said. Brother Martin was summoned from the village chapel. The monk stood by the bed, his hands folded, his voice a soft, relentless stream of Latin. He prayed to Saint Roch, patron of plague victims, and to Saint Anthony, who fought the demonic fires of ergotism. and by extension, all corruptions of the flesh. The words were a spiritual poultice applied to the soul's fear. Sir Thomas clutched the small wooden cross around his neck, his lips moving silently, but beneath the ritual, a colder, gnawing fear took root. It was the fear of the trajectory. Inflammation, fever, the rot setting in, the barber surgeon's visit, the probing with unwashed instruments, the decision, the leg or the life, the image of the saw, the leather strap to bite, the searing brand to cauterize the butchered stump. It was a spectre more terrifying than any battlefield foe, a fate that would render him not a dead knight, but a living relic, a useless burden, his utility ended not by a noble blow, but by the silent betrayal of his own flesh. Confined to the bed, a rare and unwelcome stillness descended. The constant motion of his life, the drills, the marches, the inspections, was replaced by immobility. In that stillness, pain became the dominant country, its borders expanding with every pulse of his heart. It was a tyrant, allowing no other thought. But when the fever came, as it did on the second night, the pain found allies in his mind. The cool cloth Eleanor placed on his brow did little. He drifted in a hot, shifting haze. The bedchamber walls melted, reforming into the chaotic press of battle. The throbbing in his leg became the drumbeat of a charge. He heard the screams, saw the flash of steel, felt the shocking impact of the pike that had made the scar, experiencing the wound's creation anew. But the dreams twisted. The Flemish pikeman wore the face of Lord Mowbray, demanding his marriage fee. The clanging swords transformed into the clinking of coins being counted, a cascade of silver that buried him. He was fighting not soldiers, but ledgers, not for glory, but for solvency. The physical and financial terrors merged into a single, feverish nightmare, each feeding the other. Recovery, when it slowly, grudgingly began, was its own form of torment. The fever broke, leaving him weak and drenched in sour sweat. The inflammation receded from crimson to an ugly mottled purple and yellow, like a fading bruise on rotten fruit. The pain dulled from a shriek to a constant, grinding ache, but he was helpless. To rise was to feel a dizzying weakness. To put weight on the leg was to invite a sharp, warning stab. He was reduced to a child's dependency, needing help to use the chamber pot, to wash, to shift his position in the bed. Etienne and Eleanor moved around him with careful efficiency, but their care was a mirror reflecting his own fragility. The knight, the lord of the manor, was an invalid in a stale room, watching the dust motes dance in a sliver of sunlight, a prisoner of his own convalescence. The days passed in a slow, monotonous crawl. He listened to the sounds of the manor carrying on without him, the distant chop of wood, a murmur of tenants in the yard. Eleanor's firm, quiet instructions. Each sound was a reminder of his absence from his duties, of the world turning while he lay trapped in the sluggish river of healing. The minor injury, the forgotten scar, had become an existential threat. It had demonstrated, with brutal clarity, the terrible fragility of the entire edifice. His strength, his authority, his very identity as a functional knight, all hinged on the soundness of his body. A single inch of corrupted flesh could unravel it all, rendering the armor a meaningless heap of metal, the title an empty word, the debts unpayable. The unseen enemy had not taken his leg, but it had stolen his illusion of durability, leaving in its place a cold, new knowledge that his utility, and thus his worth, was a perishable commodity, as vulnerable to decay as the manor's roof, and far harder to repair. Convalescence was a foreign country, a flat, silent plain between the jagged mountains of active duty and the familiar rolling hills of domestic burden, Sir Thomas lay propped on bolsters in his bedchamber, his bandaged leg a stiff, aching log beneath the blankets. The fever had passed, leaving his body hollowed out and his mind preternaturally clear, a pane of glass wiped clean of the daily grime. In this forced stillness with no immediate demands to deflect his gaze outward, he turned it inward, and the skin vista that unfolded was the long, winding road of his life, seen from its weary end. He looked at his hands, resting on the woolen coverlet. They were not the hands of a hero from a tapestry. They were maps of use. The knuckles were swollen and knotted, the fingers permanently curved, as if still shaped to the grip of a sword hilt or a reins. A thick, white scar ran across the back of his right hand, a gift from a dagger slash in a melee long ago. The nails were ridged and uneven, one missing entirely from a hammer blow in a makeshift forge. The skin was leathery, cross-hatched with 1,000 finer lines, stained with old grime that seemed part of the flesh itself. He tried to flex them, and they obeyed with a stiff, reluctant creak, a chorus of tiny protests. These hands had lifted a squirming infant son, now buried. They had clasped in prayer, in oath, in the grip of a dying friend. They had killed, they had tallied debts. They were the instruments of his life. And they were worn down, their strength seeping away like water from a cracked jug. On a stool beside the bed, Etienne had left a piece of his armor, the polished steel shield from his earlier days, its surface a dark, mirror-like blue. Sir Thomas reached for it, his arm trembling with the effort, and angled it towards the grey light from the window. His reflection swam into view, distorted by the gentle curve of the metal. The face that looked back was a stranger's, or rather, the ghost of the man he once was. The hair, what remained, was a wispy grey cloud. The beard was a tangle of silver and white, but it was the eyes that held him. They were the same blue but faded, like fabric left too long in the sun, and they were set in a topography of wrinkles, deep trenches from nose to mouth, fissures across the full brow, a web of finer lines radiating from the corners. The skin hung slightly loose at the jaw. This was not the face of the boy who had dreamed, nor the young knight who had believed. This was the face of the years themselves, each line a ledger entry, each sag a weight borne. The boy came first to his mind's eye, a small, thin thing with knees scraped from the Courtyard mud, listening wide-eyed to a minstrel's tale of Roland at Roncevaux. That boy had seen the armor not as a shell, but as a skin of light, a transformation that would make him righteous, glorious, invincible. He had dreamed in pure, bright colors, of rescues, of single combats, of a name sung in halls. The dream had no weight, only wings. Then, the young knight, his spurs freshly earned, heart hammering against his new cuirass, not from its constriction, but from terror and exhilaration. His first real charge was not the thunderous, unified wave of song, but a ragged, jolting gallop. The world narrowing to the churning rump of the horse ahead, the deafening crash as lines met, the shocking, ugly reality of a mace crushing a man's shoulder beside him. The glory was a faint perfume drowned by the stench of blood and fear. That was when the first weight settled. The weight of reality, cold and heavy, replacing the weightless dream. The years that followed were not a parade of heroic deeds, but a slow, granular accretion. Compromises, like smiling at a fool of a lord to secure a favor, debts, each one a chain added, link by silver link. Scars, each a story not of valor, but of survival, of pain endured and weakness revealed. The physical weight of the armor became a constant, but it was merely the tangible symbol of the others. The financial weight that bent his back over ledgers in the dark, the psychological weight of command and memory, the spiritual weight of a duty that felt less like a calling and more like a sentence. They accumulated like layers of sediment, pressing him deeper into the earth of his station. He saw the milestones not of glory, but of burden. The year the harvest failed, and he forgave the rents, tightening his own belt for a winter, the day he sold his mother's silver cross to pay a mercenary band. The night he wept silently after ordering a flogging for a man caught stealing food, knowing the theft was born of the same desperation that gnawed at him. The countless mornings, he awoke with the taste of dread already in his mouth. These were the true battles, the sieges against despair, fought not on fields, but in the quiet of his soul. The polished shield showed him the summation. An old man, a vessel filled to the brim with fatigue, with the residue of fear, with the grit of compromises, with the cold ash of extinguished hopes. The boy's dreams, the young knight's terror, the middle-aged man's grinding calculations, all were distilled here in this lined face, these stiff hands. The themes of his life were not separate strands but threads woven into a single, coarse fabric. The physical constriction, the financial vice, the psychological scars, the spiritual doubt, all different expressions of the same immense, often miserable, weight. He had carried it. He was carrying it still. The convalescence was not an escape, but a temporary depot where he could set it down and look at it. Truly look, for the first time. It was the weight of years, the cumulative mass of a life spent in service to an ideal that had buckled under its own reality. He saw no grand meaning in it, no divine pattern. He saw only the sheer, factual tonnage of it, a slow accretion that had shaped his body, his face, his very being. He was not a hero. He was a beast of burden, and the road was long, and the load was heavy, and the stable, when it came, would be the grave. He lowered the shield, the reflection vanishing, and closed his eyes, not in peace, but in a final, full acknowledgement of the weight he was, and the weight he would bear till he could bear it no more. Evening bled into the room through the narrow window, a slow wash of violet and deep gold, the last of the day's light lying gently upon the floorboards. The frantic edge of the fever was a memory, the gnawing fear of the sore, a spectre banished, at least for now. Sir Thomas sat in a heavy, high-backed chair, drawn close to the hearth. A modest fire, no more than a careful nest of glowing oak logs, murmured quietly to itself, its light a soft, dancing amber that warmed the air within a few feet and painted the rest of the chamber in warm, breathing shadows. His injured leg, still stiff and wrapped, was propped on a stool, a dull, bearable ache its only testament. The manner was quiet, not the tense quiet of waiting or the hollow quiet of absence, but a deep, settled stillness. The day's chores were done. Eleanor had retired, her own weariness, a soft sigh in the next room. Etienne and the others were bed. There were no creaking harnesses, no clatter of pots, no murmur of urgent conversation. The only sounds were the gentle rhythmic crackle of the fire and the occasional pop of a sap pocket in the wood, a sound like a tiny, contained heartbeat. The cold that usually lived in the stone seemed held at bay, repelled by this small, defiant circle of warmth. On his lap lay a small, worn book, its leather cover supple from long handling, the corners rounded, It was not a chronicle of battles or a treatise on chivalry. It was a book of hours, a gift from Eleanor long ago, its pages filled with psalms and simple contemplative verses. He opened it carefully, the parchment pages making a soft, dry whisper. The vellum was thick, its surface slightly uneven, holding the ink in valleys and peaks. He traced a line with a calloused finger, feeling the texture, the slight rays of the carefully inscribed letters. The ink was a faded brown, the hand not that of a master scribe, but competent and earnest. He did not read of David's mighty deeds or the thunder of God's wrath. His eyes found a quieter passage, a verse on the fleeting nature of days, on the grass that flourishes in the morning and is cut down by evening. It spoke not of heroism, but of transience, not of struggle, but of acceptance. The words were simple, their meaning a calm, deep pool rather than a rushing stream. They did not demand anything of him. They did not remind him of duty or debt. They simply were, a quiet observation of the world's turning, offering neither condemnation nor praise for the man who witnessed it. His gaze drifted from the page to the fire. The flames were not a roaring blaze, but a slow, conscientious consumption. Each tongue of light lovingly detailing a grain in the oak, turning it from gold to charcoal. The heat was a palpable presence on his face and hands, a dry, gentle counterpoint to the lingering chill in his mending leg. It was a humble comfort, but a complete one. There was no performance here, no armor to don, no ledger to balance, no face to compose for a superior. There was only the fire, the book, the ache in his leg, and the vast, forgiving quiet. The heaviness came upon him, gradually, not as the crushing weight of years or responsibility, but as a soft physical insistence. His eyelids, which had spent a lifetime squinting into sun, rain, and the gloom of helm interiors, grew slow and granular. The careful script on the page before him blurred, the brown letters swimming into a single peaceful smear. The crackle of the fire seemed to grow more distant, its rhythm merging with the slower rhythm of his own breath. The dull throb in his leg faded into the background, just another part of the room's gentle atmosphere. He did not fight it. The book rested open on his lap, his hand relaxed upon it. His head nodded forward slightly, his chin coming to rest against his chest. The thoughts that had chased themselves like rats in a barrel for weeks, of debt, of duty, of pain, of the relentless forward march, finally stilled. They did not vanish, but they receded, losing their sharp, demanding edges, becoming mere shapes in the middle distance of his mind, no more threatening than the shadows on the wall. The fire sighed, settling deeper into its bed of embers. A last, lingering strand of gold light from the window faded into twilight blue. In the gentle dark, Sir Thomas slept. It was not the dead, exhausted sleep of the march, nor the fevered, haunted sleep of his illness. It was a simple, profound surrender. The story of his burdens had no ending, no neat conclusion where the weight was lifted. But here, in this chair, by this modest fire, there was a temporary cessation, a comma in the long, run-on sentence of his life. The struggle was not answered.